We do have new polls from three key battleground states. The latest Marist poll of likely voters in Arizona finds former President Donald Trump ahead of Vice President Kamala Harris 50% to 49%.
Of course, the New York Times Siena poll had Donald Trump up 73 points a couple of days ago.
It's the same
Shocking
story.
It was an outlier.
With likely voters in Georgia, where the latest Marist poll from there also finds Trump ahead 50 to 49%.
1 point. Okay.
North Carolina, Trump and Harris deadlocked 49% each. All of these polls fall within their margins of error.
Really, it is shocking news. We should put breaking news at the bottom here. This election is tied. And I will say, I'm almost getting the feeling, I don't want anybody to throw tomatoes at me, I almost get the feeling that if Joe Biden had somehow managed to stay in the race, it would still be tied. Donald Trump's numbers aren't moving. It's just how many people eventually find their way back to the Democratic Party.
Yeah, it sure looks that way. There's also some Emerson polls that just came through, by the way, that showed Texas is within 5 points. I mean, obviously a long shot for a Democrat, and that Colin Aldred is hanging very close to Ted Cruz in that Senate race, which has become fascinating. Also, that in places when Joe Biden was on the ticket, and this might be the difference, that we're starting to look like they might be in play for Donald Trump, that they have now gone back, sort of reverted to the mean, that Kamala Harris in Virginia, for example, is up by 8 or 9 points this morning. So maybe that's the difference there. But yeah, you're right. It's going to be neck and neck. Donald Trump has his people locked in. He was making a speech in North Carolina yesterday about the economy. It was more of the same. It was at a pipe manufacturing plant near Charlotte. He spoke for over an hour, veering off course as he does. At one point, went on a long tangent about his personal experiences of buying furniture in North Carolina, prompting even Fox News to cut away from his speech.
North Carolina was once the beating heart of American manufacturing. I know it very well. I was here many times to buy furniture for buildings. I'd come and I'd look, and there was nobody like the craftsmen of North Carolina. It was filled with companies like this one and known everywhere for its incredible craftsmanship and skill. I know from personal experience, though, that I was a big buyer. I bought a lot of things here. That there was no place for furniture in particular like North Carolina. You were the furniture capital of the world, but now so much of that business has been stolen from you, and it's made in China and other places. And by the way, it's not as good. The quality is nowhere near. You made furniture. You bought a chair. It was good for 30 years. You buy some of these chairs that they sell you now, they break after about 2 months. The people are laying on the floor, suing you for giving a bad chair. Then on top of it all, our government keeps them out. Then on top of it all, you get sued because they fell out of a chair at a hotel. Boy, oh boy, you made the best product. You made the best furniture. After the twin betrayals of NAFTA, which I ended, and China's entry into the WTO, World Trade, North Carolina lost over 300,000 manufacturing jobs quickly, including 60% of its furniture manufacturing jobs, and that number was going up until I came along.
All right, well, we're going to continue to watch this. We carried this economic speech in its entirety for almost an hour and a half yesterday. We're told that the rest of the speech will very much echo what we heard yesterday.
Will echo buying furniture in North Carolina. Willie, the thing that we have to grasp here is that this race is still tied.
Yeah.
I mean, you look at that. You're like, wait, we're tied. That guy, Mr. Shark, Mr. Hannibal Lecter, And I will say, I moved to amend my previous remarks. You bring up some great points. I mean, Joe Biden was seeing numbers in Minnesota, in Virginia, in New Hampshire get too close for comfort there. So you may be right. There is, I said there may be no difference. Maybe no difference in Donald Trump's number, but difference in how quickly people are getting back to the Democratic ticket. Yeah. But you are right. You look at Texas, that race is within 5, and in most polls we see Ted Cruz in the margin of error in most of the recent polls we've seen. Florida also a pretty tight race. Word is that Chuck Schumer is thinking about burying a lot of money in Florida, hoping to take out the Florida senator there, a Republican senator there. So it has gotten, some of these battleground states have gotten tighter, old battleground states, and some new ones are getting put in play.
Yeah, the investing in Florida, in Texas, and places maybe they wouldn't be investing in a couple of months ago. And let's not forget, Kamala Harris, since she moved to the top of the ticket, has raised gobs of money for the Democratic Party and energized the base to go out and knock on doors and put up yard signs and do all of those things. You do have to laugh, though, Joe, about Donald Trump. The idea that when he was running his terrible casinos in Atlantic City, he was going down to North Carolina and hand-picking the furniture that would be in every hotel room. I want that. And talking to the craftsmen about what they did. But then he worried about the lawsuits later when people would fall off of the Chinese-made chairs. These are
chairs, yes, exactly.
relatable problems that we all have. Let's bring in the conversation.
Kamala Harris. Now, she has been driving news coverage for her campaigning, for her speeches, for her political interviews. You might have seen some of them. But today, it is actually her day job as vice president, which is center stage. Harris holding a joint presentation with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky at the White House. And she and President Biden met with him today, the Biden-Harris administration, fortifying the ongoing aid to Ukraine in its fight against Putin's invasion. So they added another $8 billion. That's an additional military aid. This has been now a multi-year effort. Harris also condemning Putin's invasion and saying that Vladimir Putin is breaking international law.
Proud to stand with Ukraine. I will continue to stand with Ukraine, and I will work to ensure Ukraine prevails in this war. To be safe, secure, and prosperous, the United States must continue to fulfill our long-standing role of global leadership. We must stand with our allies and our partners. We must defend our democratic values and stand up to aggressors. And we must stand for international order.
Madam Vice President, thanks for the invitation. Happy to see you. This is our, you said, seventh meeting?
Seventh.
Yes, and not last.
Not last is a reference to the ongoing U.S. alliance with the administration, not an election prediction, although people could hear that any number of ways if she becomes President Harris. Now, this foreign policy work is serious. It could be life and death for the people in that region. But America's election also hangs over this right now as we are in the fall general election season. Having a presidential candidate who is doing White House level diplomacy can underscore the experience substantively and the visual politically that many campaigns would dream of. Harris aides clearly understand that showing voters that she's doing this job reinforces why she's up to the big job. And that's always been a factual edge for Kamala Harris. She has more experience in government and executive positions than most party nominees who make their first White House bid. In fact, you can say that runs back over the decades, and I've shown you this before. It's relevant tonight when you think about that final little layer cake, the VP above the Senate, the AG, and the DA experience, the 20-plus years. She has that experience. So when people say their concern with Kamala Harris is she's not experienced, they either don't know she has this experience or they don't care. And they're sort of saying that against all facts as a proxy for something else. There's, by the way, an even larger gap with her opponent's chosen running mate, J.D. Vance, would be a heartbeat from the presidency with very little time in office. You can see their comparison, and that's if you count all of Harris's early time in unelected but government positions like assistant DA. So the complex international geopolitics and the standard domestic politics are part of both of those meetings today. They're both in the conversation. Voters also have the choice on foreign policy here, and nobody has said this feels like it's going to be some big foreign policy election when the concerns have been about our own domestic issues with autocratic attacks, Donald Trump's failed coup, prices, inflation, the age and experience of the candidates, all the domestic stuff. But there's still a sharp contrast here, and if there's any night to talk about it, it's tonight when you look at this meeting. Remember, America's two major parties used to have a much more united front against Russia and Soviet aggression. It was Donald Trump who pushed the GOP towards Putin. That's pretty well known. and Democrats' support of Ukraine, NATO, and democracy over Putin's ongoing autocracy and attacks on what would largely seem to be peaceful neighbors, that is a contrast from Harris to what Trump is offering.
Throughout Putin's brutal aggression and war against Ukraine, my support for the people of Ukraine is unwavering. I've been proud to stand with Ukraine. I will continue to stand with Ukraine, and I will work to ensure Ukraine prevails in this war. The United States supports Ukraine not out of charity, but because it is in our strategic interest.
Ukraine is gone. It's not Ukraine anymore. You can never replace those cities and towns, and you can never replace the dead people, so many dead people. Any deal, even the worst deal, would have been better than what we have right now. If they made a bad deal, it would have been much better. They would have given up a little bit, and everybody would be living.
Those are both from this week. Now, one person is in government and is speaking from that position, as I showed you, with the vice president's experience and actually holding a meeting there with the Ukrainian leader. The other person, though, used to be president. You might say he knows better. He certainly knows how this works. And those are two very different responses to the events as they are unfolding now. No one can tell you, I certainly can't tell you, whether a lot of voters are going to look at foreign policy or this type of experience as relevant to their choice with all the other issues around. But that's what's going on. And the split from the Republican Party away from what I'm calling that pro-democracy NATO alliance is striking. It is wrought by Trump. But even Donald Trump this week sees some reason or utility to say that he's offering a dialogue with Putin's enemy in Ukraine right now. Trump has announced, he says he'll meet with President Zelensky as well tomorrow. He says they will huddle in the morning at Trump Tower. Now, this is the news. I'm telling you what Trump said. We can watch for what happens tomorrow. But either way, it is a reinforcement of how the guy who asked for Russian help in 2016 invited Putin to help go after his opponent, Hillary Clinton, steal her emails, a guy who's been an apologist for Putin time and time again. Even he right now wants you to know that he says he's open to this dialogue with Zelensky. Take that for what you will. As for experience in filling the shoes of commander-in-chief, it is always a big deal whether someone who's never held the job before is seen as up to it, even someone as experienced as Vice President Harris. And so these things that we're hearing from people in and around the national security community, including a lot of endorsements and backing for her matter right now. And today, there's a big one, a name you might recall from the pantheon of prominent and sometimes controversial generals. This is from retired Army General Stanley McChrystal, who writes, "Character is the ultimate measure of leadership for those who seek the highest office. Character will dictate whether we stand by our NATO allies and against Putin's continued aggression." And he is announcing this endorsement, as you can see in the New York Times, saying, "I've cast my ballot for character and voted for Vice President Harris." The past tense tells you he's cast his early vote ballot, and we've been reporting on that as well. The election starts earlier. We're talking past tense voting in September. So all of this is about those things, what McChrystal calls character, what other people refer to as experience, and the general vision, the differing visions you have about foreign policy. How would you protect the homeland? How would you wage foreign policy? How will you deal with these ongoing crises, which you have there with the land war in Europe and the unrest in the Middle East? And at the debate, we heard Harris, knowing this might be the only debate. Remember, in different years, we've had a foreign policy-focused debate, but she knew this might be the only one they got. And she took time during that big appearance, with more people watching that than anything else in politics this year, to go directly at Trump's foreign policy.
I have traveled the world as Vice President of the United States, and world leaders are laughing at Donald Trump. I have talked with military leaders, some of whom worked with you, and they say you're a disgrace.
I'll get the war with Ukraine and Russia ended. If I'm president-elect, I'll get it done before even becoming president.
If Donald Trump were president, Putin would be sitting in Kyiv right now.
I want to ask you a very simple question tonight. Do you want Ukraine to win this war?
I want the war to stop. I know Putin very well.
A dictator who would eat you for lunch
Viktor Orban, one of the most respected men, they call him a strong man.
You adore strong men instead of caring about democracy. I agreed with President Biden's decision to pull out of Afghanistan. 4 presidents said they would, and Joe Biden did.
That's the policy debate. The fact that former President Trump can't say he wants Ukraine to win the war so that the people there might live. He wants the war to stop. But the war was Russia invading Ukraine. Putin has continued it on. The way Russia wants the war to stop, the only way they have acted like it would stop, is if they take over all of Ukraine. So that is a big and sharp contrast. All of this is about policy. For all the talk of politics and campaign ads and targeting different groups, there is still policy going on. We'll cover it whenever it happens, whenever it's in the reality. The Harris campaign clearly thinks that having policy discussions there about geopolitical and foreign policy, as you saw her prioritize the debate, and economic and domestic policy are still in her interest. So that's where policy meets politics. She gave that big economic address yesterday. She spoke in that MSNBC exclusive interview focused on economics. And we heard from CNBC's Andrew Ross Sorkin, who was helping us make sense of Harris's economic plans in that big address. And he also told us about the concern among Wall Street executives that Donald Trump could bring even more chaos to America.
Talking about pricing. On Wall Street, they call it beta, which is what's the spread, meaning what's the good and the bad. And I think what's happened
I thought the spread was delta. See, I learned something
delta
every
too.
day.
Okay, we go delta. We can use delta in this context. But no, it would actually work in this context. I think some people look at Harris and they say the beta or the delta is not a lot. You know, you actually do know what you're getting with her.
It seems
for the most part.
Yeah, I understood. Yep.
And with him, it's massive. Could it turn out to be okay? Maybe it could.
Depends who you are. Yeah, depends who you are.
Could democracy end? It could. And so that's the delta. Yeah. That's the beta, if you will, that I think the business community, in their own way, is trying to imagine.
Fair. That's what a lot of people are trying to imagine or plan for or price for.
Aspirations of our people seizes the opportunities before us because we see them, because we believe in them, and then invents the future. That is what we have always done. And that is what we must now do. And I know we will. I thank you all for inviting me. May God bless you. May God bless the United States of America.
That was Vice President Kamala Harris about 24 hours ago in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in a speech laying out her economic vision for America. The vice president has made at least 8 visits to the must-win battleground since launching her campaign. Polling averages show Harris leading by less than 1%. Let's bring into our conversation Pennsylvania's Governor Josh Shapiro. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Good to be with you.
Good to be with you. It strikes me that we got to know you, our audience got to know you, when you were Pennsylvania's Attorney General and when the ex-president was challenging his rather sizable defeat in the Commonwealth. Just tell me, with an eye toward his antics last time and what you describe in a podcast as essentially a tie in Pennsylvania, how is the state preparing for what we know Trump will try to do again? Claim he won if he lost and potentially cheat.
Yeah. Well, as you recall, last time Donald Trump did everything he could to first try and make it harder for certain people to vote. And then after the votes were counted, he tried to make it so certain votes weren't tabulated and weren't ultimately reflected in the will of the people. Here's the good news. We had a free and fair, safe and secure election. The will of the people was protected and respected. And Donald Trump took us to court 43 times. He went 0-43, and I went 43-0 as the Commonwealth's Attorney General, and we protected Pennsylvanians. We knew that he would try his same old tactics again. And in fact, we've already begun to see some litigation to try and make it harder for certain people's votes to count. About 9 months ago, I put together an election protection task force here in the Commonwealth, made up of lawyers, made up of election clerks, made up of law enforcement at the local, state, and federal level, and chaired by our Secretary of the Commonwealth, Al Schmidt. I should point out, Al is a Republican. I'm a Democrat, because we believe the administration of elections should be really nonpartisan or bipartisan exercises. And we are already and have been working. We've been doing tabletop exercises. We are ready to go for whatever Donald Trump throws our way. And most importantly, to protect the will of the people again here in Pennsylvania. And I'm confident we'll again have a free and fair, safe and secure election.
In your tabletops, and I was part of a lot of those when I worked in government after 9/11, I mean, it's your job to imagine the stickiest scenarios and then solve for them. Do you take Trump at his word, and do you watch the actions of his ally, the Speaker of the House, when they sort of dangle their coded language? Well, we'll only certify if it's totally free and fair. I mean, they count mail-in voting, which is legal, including in Pennsylvania, as something sort of on the bubble for them. Are you looking at everything they're saying in terms of solving for all scenarios?
Yeah, everything. And by the way, I'd point out that mail-in voting here in Pennsylvania was made legal with more votes from Republican lawmakers than Democratic lawmakers in the end. I mean, this should be non-controversial. We want to promote democracy, and the way you do that is by encouraging legal eligible voters to participate in the process. But since Donald Trump said he doesn't like it, then Republicans have lined up. Look, when it comes to our preparations, our tabletop exercises, we are thinking about everything from the stuff that Donald Trump and his allies say to mis and disinformation that might make its way out on the media. And I'm not suggesting MSNBC by any stretch, but something that has a national reach and then kind of infiltrates our politics and people's opinions. We're thinking about litigation and how that can be used as a tool to disenfranchise people. We're thinking about whether or not people are violent in our communities as a way to try and stoke fear or make it harder for people to access the ballot box. We're thinking about all of those things. And I want the good people of Pennsylvania to know we are prepared. And Republican and Democratic clerks alike in our 67 counties are prepared to do their jobs honorably, as they did last time, to make sure that we again have a free and fair, safe and secure election, and that the will of the people is respected.
The Commonwealth is in the news as another place that Donald Trump has targeted with lies about legal Haitian immigrants. I wonder if you can just tell us what's happening in Charleroi and tell me what you're prepared to do to protect your citizens, your constituents.
Yeah. Charleroi is a wonderful small town in a place called Washington County, Pennsylvania. So for those of you who aren't familiar, that's closer to kind of the Ohio-West Virginia border in the southwestern corner of our Commonwealth. It's a great community with wonderful people. And the truth is they've got some economic challenges. Instead of this would-be or wannabe president coming and trying to address the economic anxieties and the very real challenges there, instead, he's tried to throw gasoline on a fire in a wonderful community and target certain people in this community. When he targets them, it not only makes those migrants, those legal migrants, less safe, it makes us all less safe. Tearing down communities is not something we want from a would-be leader of this nation. We want a leader to lift people up and actually address the very serious challenges that they face. You know, Nicole, Lori and I are blessed with 4 children, and we try and teach them a lot of lessons, but the one underlying lessons is to love thy neighbor, right? I mean, I think that is something that we can all agree is central to how we try and raise our children. We should expect at least that from the person that wants to lead this nation. I want someone like Kamala Harris who looks to lift everyone up, no matter what they look like, where they come from, who they love or who they pray to. Not someone like Donald Trump who tries to tear people down, create others in our society, and make us all less safe. Charleroi is a great town. And you know what? Washington County, we don't need a wannabe politician from Washington, D.C. to step in and make us less safe. We're going to stand up with one another. We're going to lift one another up. We're going to address our economic challenges, as I'm doing every day as governor. And we're going to work with people, Democrat and Republican alike, who want to do things that are constructive and helpful, not things that are harmful to our communities, like what Donald Trump continues to spew.
I mean, I think you're right about the values that any parent, regardless of who they voted for in the past, is passing along to their children. But then how do you explain the closeness of the race in Pennsylvania?
Well, look, the race is close, and our last two presidential races have come down to 44,000 votes and 80,000 votes, about a point or less in our Commonwealth of 13 million people with about 9 million registered voters. The fact that it's close is not a shock. And listen, picking up that last yard or two in the red zone to get in the end zone, it's tough here. But here's the thing. I'd rather be us than them. I'd rather be Kamala Harris than Donald Trump, and here's why. I think she's beginning to play on his side of the field. She's been in rural communities competing for a vote. She's someone who I think has an economic message that's beginning to resonate with people who might not have been open to hearing it just a few weeks ago. She is someone who promises more economic opportunity and more freedom. Donald Trump, on his watch, we had less freedom and fewer jobs in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. I think that there is a stark choice in this race. And while it is close, I'd rather be us than them.
You assembled an ideologically diverse coalition. You had many high-profile Republicans choosing you enthusiastically over Doug Mastriano. She, too, has assembled an almost historically ideologically diverse coalition. Would you deploy some of the Republicans that have endorsed her in places like Erie or other parts of the state? I mean, how did you deploy your Republicans for Shapiro to win in the numbers that you won?
Yeah. Well, look, I think it's really important that people understand that you're going to be a governor, or in Kamala Harris's case, a president, for all Pennsylvanians, for all Americans. And I think one of the most important ways we do that is by showing that we have support from rural, urban, suburban communities, men and women, people of all colors, people who come from all different places, and, of course, people from different political parties. I think at a time where we've become so polarized politically, showing that you can reach across the aisle and not just attract someone's support in an election, but that you can govern in a way that keeps them as part of an inclusive coalition, something we've been able to do here in Pennsylvania. I think that's critically important. I also think it's important that we understand that we don't have to agree with an elected official on every single issue to vote for them. Because we want people who are honorable. We want people who, as I talked about before, pass that basic test we set for our children of loving thy neighbor. We want someone who actually gives a damn about all of us, not just focused on themselves. Someone who's trying to lift up communities, not tear them down. There's a clear contrast in this race. And I think the more Kamala Harris can lean on people who maybe historically wouldn't have considered voting for a Democrat but are now, I think that's really, really powerful. And it's something I've done here in Pennsylvania. It's something I would encourage her to continue to do here in the Commonwealth and across the country.
What is it?
Joining us now, NBC News White House correspondent Ali Rafa, New York Times chief White House correspondent and MSNBC political analyst Peter Baker, Punchbowl News co-founder and MSNBC political contributor Jake Sherman, and Atlantic staff writer and MSNBC political contributor Mark Leibovich. So, Ali, what's the latest on Zelensky's meetings? Is he now done with President Biden? Has he moved on yet to VP Harris?
He has, Katie, and we are expecting these remarks with President Zelensky and Vice President Harris to happen soon. And what we can expect is the vice president to really talk about what we heard President Biden first say during that Oval Office spray at the top of his meeting with President Zelensky, in which he said he was proud to announce this new aid package going to Ukraine today, proud to announce that he has directed the Pentagon to allocate all the remaining security assistance that has been approved to go to Ukraine, And all of this is an effort to really enshrine his legacy as a longtime supporter of Ukraine and its fight against Russia, trying to enshrine that legacy. And another part of that effort is this meeting and these remarks that Zelensky is going to have with Vice President Harris. This is going to be their 7th time meeting. Their last time was in July in Switzerland, right before President Biden announced he was dropping out of the 2024 race. So we could expect the vice president to tout the work that President Biden has done in this arena, the 20 aid packages that the Biden administration has already sent to Ukraine, and these new announcements today in the form of more military funding, more weapons, an expansion of the Pentagon's training program for Ukrainian F-16 fighter pilots. And so the White House is really using this opportunity to tout the vice president's foreign policy chops and her expertise in this arena, and really pledge that she is going to continue the president's legacy if elected in November.
Peter Baker, President Biden has done an admirable job of keeping the NATO alliance together. He gets a lot of credit from that from a lot of different circles. Is Kamala Harris going to be able to do the same? And should we expect her policy toward Ukraine to be any different from that of President Biden?
Well, look, she won't come into this with the same expertise and same relationships and history that Joe Biden had, right? Joe Biden has known these other NATO leaders, these European leaders, for years and years, in some cases decades. And he obviously brought a lot of credibility to the table when he had to stitch together the alliance again after it frayed under President Trump. But it's fair to say that even if she doesn't bring that to the table, she's certainly going to bring the same general belief in alliances. And that's a stark contrast from Trump, who doesn't believe in alliances. He believes that the allies are trying to shaft the United States. He's much more hostile towards Germany than he is to Russia. He has spent more time heaping, criticism on the European allies, Canadian allies, Japanese allies than he ever has on Vladimir Putin, who he has called a genius. So I think that the contrast between Trump and Harris when it comes to the alliance is as stark as they come.
What do you make, Mark, of the way that former President Trump is talking about Zelensky? I mean, he was kind of cagey about what he would do or what he would not do, and now he's just coming out and saying that he doesn't like the guy.
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of a window into what foreign policy was and probably would be if Trump wins, which is basically a kind of cavalier sort of me approach, which is, look, I feel snubbed by Vladimir Zelensky. I feel like he has slighted your favorite president, me. And look, I get along well with Putin, which, he's been saying for 7-8 years now. He would listen to me. This would never have happened. And, we've heard this all before. So, yeah, it's the foreign policy of me. It's the foreign policy of that has nothing to do with alliances or stitching anything together or working with anyone. It's the foreign policy of one man, one set of relationships, one ego and so forth. So, yeah, that's a window into, just the sort of entire sort of sensibility that's on the ballot in November.
Let's do a callback to a conversation that you had with Donald Trump. You wrote about it in the latest issue of The Atlantic. You said that he told you Republican politicians would be easy to break. You say he was right. Explain that.
Yeah, well, this was 2015, 2016, back when he used to talk to traitorous reporters like me and Peter and JP and everyone. I remember I spent a lot of time with him then, like a lot of us did. He used to talk about, look, they might be trashing me now, but I will bend them to my will because these are weak saplings. These are saps and weaklings, and politicians will roll right over when I tell them to. And it was kind of amazing looking back, reading all that, and I kind of sort of sketched that into the future, which sort of paints a picture of Trump having been completely prescient and absolutely correct about, the whole, the vast majority of Republican putative leaders over the last several years, just bending a knee to him, which is why he's able to do this and get away with what he gets away with now, and is just one election from the presidency again.
What's so remarkable, Jake, and you know this well, is that he's not in office and he still has that same power, torpedoing the bipartisan immigration bill, which was largely conservative. How much influence did he have over the current speaker's decision not to meet with President Zelensky?
Well, I can tell you what the available evidence is, Katie. The available evidence is that, well, first of all, let's start with this. Mike Johnson said he had scheduling conflicts. He didn't even know if he'd be in town today. Congress left last night for the most part. There's still some people around the Capitol. But He sent a letter yesterday to Zelensky asking him to fire the ambassador to the U.S. because that ambassador theoretically facilitated a trip for Zelensky to go to Pennsylvania to a munitions factory where he appeared with Josh Shapiro, the Democratic governor, and Bob Casey, the Democratic senator. Casey is up for re-election this year, number one. Number two, Mike Johnson is not meeting again with Zelensky today. There was a bipartisan meeting today, Republicans and Democrats on both sides of the Capitol. On the Senate side, it included Chuck Schumer and Mitch McConnell. On the House side, it included Hakeem Jeffries, several committee chairs, and top Democrats. Mike Johnson did not attend. Now, could we draw a straight line? No. He said he had scheduling conflicts. He didn't know if he'd be in town. But the evidence is pretty overwhelming that for Johnson, sitting down with Zelensky right now would not be good for his political future. Whether that was the exact reason, we can't say. But it would be treacherous. He's going to face, if Republicans keep the House majority, he'll face a speaker race in which he will need, whether Trump wins or loses, Donald Trump's support. So it's probably a stretch to say he calls the shots, but he's certainly the background music of everything that Republicans do on Capitol Hill.
Is he still going to be somebody in a position to call shots if he does lose this next election? Will people like Speaker Mike Johnson, say he's still a speaker, be listening as closely to Donald Trump? If Kamala Harris has a Republican-led majority in the House or even in the Senate, on the subject of Ukraine, if Donald Trump loses, will she have an easier time getting funding, or will it be harder?
I would say this, Katie, it's actually almost irrelevant because most of the Republicans, many of the Republicans have just turned in on policy to carbon copies of Trump on a subject like Ukraine. I mean, there are 220 House Republicans, there are 150 of them, 100 of them or something like that, who don't want to give any more money to Ukraine. The Republican Party, as Mark pointed out in that piece, has adopted Trump's position on every critical issue facing the nation today. The vast majority of them. It is the minority of the Republican Party supports a small minority, not a small minority, a pretty healthy minority, but supports the traditional Republican policies of the past. And I think that's pretty telling.
I think it's also interesting, Peter, that the way that President Zelensky has been talking about American politics has changed as well. He's been much more critical of Donald Trump and J.D. Vance than he had been in the past. What's the deal with that change?
Country is at risk and is being bombarded daily by a hostile invader. And J.D. Vance says, quote, I don't care about what happens to Ukraine. And Donald Trump says that Putin is a genius and that his version of a peace plan would be to give up conquered territory and reward Russian aggression. So surprise, surprise, Ukraine doesn't find the Republican ticket to be all that supportive, and therefore hasn't kowtowed to them in the way that the Republicans want them to kowtow. It's remarkable that Mike Johnson feels upbraided by Zelensky when he held up aid to Ukraine for 6 to 8 months. Basically, if Ukraine has lost ground in this war over the last year, it's in large part because of that. So surprise, surprise, again, Ukrainians don't find that the Republicans have been all that supportive.